I was always interested in local history when I was a kid, actually. Um, my parents would take us to historical things, to parks, to museums. I think a lot of it had to do with that. And then when I became interested in archaeology, I remember a couple of conversations with people when they said, "Oh, don't you want to go to the excavate at the pyramids in Egypt and that sort of thing?" And by then, I had become so interested in the story that is in our own backyards, that local archaeology, local, focusing on what you see around you, and thinking about the hundreds of thousands of people who have walked here before was really very compelling to me. Actually, and a lot of this is linked to photographs. My mom made a picture book of for all of her kids, and there's a picture of me um, at Black Hawk State Park in northwestern Illinois. And it's a park named after a famous Anishinaabe warrior chief, Black Hawk. And I think there's this questioning look on my face. I think I really was wondering, who was this guy, and why is this place dedicated to him, and why is it important? Why did people think to preserve this location? Um, so I think that, as a child, I think that was kind of a prescient moment, if you will, um, a moment that sort of foretold what was to come. So history is a discipline that looks at the past, but so is archaeology. But we use different methods, and sometimes they intersect, especially when we're doing the archaeology of the historic or written record past. Um, uh, Anthropology is a little bit different in that we tend to be interested in living peoples and their stories. And anthropology, as a social science, has tried to carve out its place, um, looking at people whose voices are not often heard through the historic record. I guess that's where the three things come together. So at the beginning of anthropology, anthropologists were going to um, places in the South Pacific and Africa and other exotic locations to try and understand local cultures, because there was no written record. So I think there's an intersection there, that archaeology and anthropology are interested in people who have not had a voice with written records. But there are some intersections where anthropology, archaeology, and history come together. I took a gen ed class at Northwestern University my freshman year, after realizing that studying French was not for me. And I got a kind of lousy grade in the class, but I found it so fascinating that there were actually people who went out and did the kind of National Geographic things that I'd read about when I was a kid. That people would actually go to places like New Guinea and Africa, and they could do that for a living. And so I took that class, and then I took another class, and finally I took an archaeology class and realized that there was a field school opportunity through Northwestern, and went to that field school. Had to convince my parents because I was a little bit young and naive at the time. Um, uh, Went to a field school in Southern Illinois. I grew up in Illinois, so it was more or less local. And it was a transformative experience. So having gone there, uh, at the end of that field school, I knew I was good at doing that. I was told I was good at doing it. So I'd had a lot of positive affirmation. I loved it. And I said, I remember this transformative moment going to the professor who led the field school, a man named Stuart Strever. What do you need to do to be an archaeologist? And he said, you got to get a PhD. It's the license to practice. So that became my quest. And I've done archaeology, that was in 1968. So I've done archaeology for what is that, 53 years. They are like a field camp where you work with a staff usually, and students who are getting academic credit for learning the skills and techniques of doing archaeology. And this is where, you know, we do differ from most historians, because we learn how to dig square holes in the ground and record data and make observations about soil color and, you know, and all sorts of other things. It's a different data set. And the thing that's important about a field school is that archaeology, unlike other disciplines, is a destructive kind of discipline. So that when you dig a site, you're actually destroying the site. You're destroying it in a good way, hopefully, because you're recording very carefully everything that you have found, and pardon my dogs. You are recording very carefully everything that you've observed and recovered. A lot of people liken the excavation of an archaeological site without recording the information, without making that careful observation and recording everything, the context of the artifacts and how they're related to all the other artifacts and how that particular site is related to other sites. That kind of data, when you lose that data, it's like ripping pages out of a book. That's the sort of visual phrase that you can think of. And it's the only book on that particular subject. It's archaeological sites are not being written today. You know, they're gone. You know, the people who live there are long gone. And so if it, in the process of excavating them to understand that past, if you don't create a record of what you did and what you saw and what you observed, you are destroying the past. My field research is, and therefore my field schools are driven by research questions. They're not driven by um, uh, they're not driven by the need to teach students specific techniques and things. They're driven by the research. And along the way, students might learn certain kinds of research skills at one kind of site, but they would be different if we were at a different kind of site. So I have, I don't know how many different locations I've worked. I've done field work on I think about this in terms of 3 river systems, and the Kalamazoo, the Grand, and the Muskegon. So I've done field work on all 3 of those river systems, and all of it engaging students, and at multiple locations. I would say there are probably 5 or 6 that were more lengthy, that there was a longer engagement with multiple field seasons, for example. Um, but you know, we move around depending on the research questions that we're interested in addressing. When I arrived at Grand Valley in 1990, I inherited a program that was very richly steeped in local history and local archaeology. And it became my passion and objective to continue that program and engage students in local field schools, and in not just stopping there, because once you dig it out of the ground, you have to do something with it. You can't just put it in a box and leave it on a shelf. You have to take the objects and all of the data and the information and make sense of it. And so I've tried to involve students not only in the field school portion, taking them to archaeological sites in the region and helping them learn the skills and techniques of archaeology, but to give them research opportunities after the field school in the lab, doing presentations at professional meetings, writing papers that get published. I've co-authored a bunch of stuff with students. It's a full package. It's not just digging this stuff out of the ground. It's following it through from the discovery, the excavation, the analysis, and the report writing. It's a complete effort. So I've tried to involve students in all of those levels, and in working in the lab too. So I've tried to get students to do curation work that doesn't have anything to do with data analysis necessarily. So there are lots of ways to involve students in real hands-on kind of research and engagement with the past. Our department has both a major and a minor, and we draw a lot of students from other disciplines. In fact, that's one of the things that is very attractive to me about anthropology. It's a real holistic discipline that draws on other disciplines. So I had students who were interested in the analysis of animal bones, so they had a background in biology. Students interested in plants, so they had a background in botany. Students from geology and history, and especially when we were working on a couple of the local historical sites. I had a student who was a double major in history and anthropology who is now he's now a PhD candidate at American University in Washington. So, there's some really neat things that come out of that. We learn about who we are, first of all, as a people, not just Caucasian people who've been here for the last few hundred years, but we learn about all of the people who have engaged in this particular landscape. It's not just the last few hundred years that are important. It's the period of time before that as well. Folks who lived here before have had experience with this land and with this landscape that can't be told or understood for the most part because there are no written records. There's oral history. People have oral traditions, and archaeologists pay attention. Increasingly, we are paying attention to the oral traditions of people who are still here, the indigenous populations of this area. But the nitty gritty, how they made their living from day to day, where did they camp? How did they engage in the environment? Those kinds of questions really do require a different kind of data set than oral tradition. But what's exciting to me is that we're now doing some great work putting oral traditions and the archaeological record together. So I think it's important. To tell the story of the people who were here before me, us. I think it's important to understand from past mistakes. Why did some people make a commitment to a particular food strategy or subsistence strategy, and they went bust? How can we learn from their past mistakes so that we don't make the same kinds of mistakes? So I think there are multiple reasons to look at the past, to learn from past mistakes, to enrich our own knowledge of who was here before, to understand how people, not just us, have engaged in this landscape. And then I think finally, I think that there is a powerful curiosity that people have about the people who lived here before. And so archaeology helps tell that story. We're not the only voice in telling the story, but we help tell the story. And that is a service to the public that is a little bit different. And it is done through museums and interpretive, other kinds of interpretive displays and so forth. Popular public literature that is very scarce on the subject of archaeology, by the way. But I think that it's a rambling explanation. There are, I think, four things we can learn about the mistakes of the past. we can understand how people engaged in the landscape in the past. Um, we can help tell the stories of people who were here before us that are not told otherwise. And we can provide a story to help other people understand the folks who were here before. What immediately pops to my mind is that the past, because it is a fragile resource, if you will, it's a fragile, non-renewable resource of information and understanding. If we don't engage with local communities, that resource is going to disappear. There is legislation, for example, to protect archaeological sites on federal land, and federally funded, licensed, and permitted projects have to have a consideration of archaeology done. But at the bottom of all of this, if we don't help educate the public through community engagement about the preciousness of this resource, we're gonna lose the story. The pages are gonna get ripped from the book. If somebody decides to build something that doesn't have this kind of federal protection, and there's lots of that going on, there's nothing that says those folks have to pay attention to the archaeology. And so if we don't help them understand the preciousness of the resource, they're not gonna care. I think one of the most important things that I've been able to do, and the fruits of that labor are gonna be seen, I think, for some time, is work that I've tried to do with the Indigenous community. They are a particularly important local community that has not been heard with regard to archaeological resources. And so through the 80s and 90s in particular, into the 90s, there was a really difficult relationship between archaeologists and the local Indigenous population, not just here, but everywhere across the United States, which resulted in a federal law that required archaeologists and Indigenous people to talk to each other for the first time, basically. And so one of the things that I became interested in doing, and this is an intersection of field schools and my job description as a professor, I guess, was to try to engage Indigenous students in the discipline of archaeology. In the past, archaeology was pretty much an old white guy's, kind of discipline. Women in archaeology were very rare until the 60s and 70s. And there were literally, I can think of next to no Indigenous archaeologists, people who were doing the archaeology of their own historical past or prehistoric past. So one of the things I tried to do in the 90s was, through my field schools, recruit local high school kids, Indigenous high school kids. And I was able to do this with the help of a dear friend, Deb Muller, who has passed away. But several of those students who did field schools with us have become archaeologists. They have, they walk in both worlds. They walk in their Indigenous world, but they also understand what archaeology is about. And I think that's, and I'll tell you also, I think the Anglo or Caucasian students that I've taught have learned the lesson of how important it is to interact and be open and transparent with Indigenous people. So I think that's a really important lesson that I learned fairly early on and tried to address through field schools and research opportunities. I sponsored a couple of McNair students um, who were Native Indigenous people, and they went on to grad school, and I mean, it's that kind of legacy that I think is really important.